At a family dinner, my sister announced she was taking my apartment as her wedding gift because the family decided. No discussion, no ask, just a fact handed to me across the table like I was a storage unit they were emptying. I didn't argue. I didn't even finish my meal. By 3 a.m., I had changed every lock in that apartment, thrown my essentials into a bag, and vanished. 28 messages in 48 hours. They didn't ask where I was. They asked how dare I this is what happened when the daughter they trained to be independent finally used that independence against them. This isn't a story about a fight over an apartment. It's about what happens when the family you've been carrying finally asks you to disappear. My name is Mallory, and by the time that dinner happened, I had already spent 23 years learning how to be useful without being seen. The apartment wasn't a gift. It was the only thing I owned outright, 400 square feet I paid for with jobs no one in my family knew I had. When my sister said the family decided, she meant they assumed I would fold. They had never been wrong before, but to understand why 3 a.m. felt like the only sane response, you need to understand the silence that came before it. I grew up in a house where love was measured in what you could do for others. By the time I was 7, I knew my job was to take up as little space as possible. Not because anyone said it out loud, but because the silence around my existence was loud enough. My sister Chloe was 2 years younger, but she occupied a different world inside the same walls. When she cried, the house stopped. When she laughed, everyone wanted to know why. When she brought home a drawing, it went on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a star. When I brought home an A on a math test, my mother said good job while washing dishes and never turned around. The pattern was so consistent it felt like gravity. Chloe got dance lessons, art camps, a new wardrobe every season. I got hand-me-downs from a cousin I barely knew, a bus pass at 12, and the same phrase every time I asked for something. You're independent, you don't need as much. They said it like it was a compliment. It felt like a dismissal, like calling a plant drought-resistant so you never had to water it. By middle school, I had stopped asking. I learned to fill my own bowl, iron my own clothes, and navigate the school system without a parent's signature on permission slips. My father drove Chloe to gymnastics and horseback riding. I took 2 buses to the library and stayed until closing. No one asked where I was. No one needed to. I was the reliable one. There was a moment I remember clearly. 8th grade winter. I had a solo in the holiday concert, a small part, 16 bars of a song I had practiced for weeks in my room behind a closed door. The night of the concert, I stood on stage and watched the audience land on my parents' faces. They were there, but their eyes were on their phones. Chloe had a stomach bug, and they were checking in with the babysitter. I sang my 16 bars to a row of camera phones held by other people's parents. Afterward, my father patted my shoulder and said, "Good job, kiddo. Let's get home. Your sister's been asking for you." I was 13. I already knew the math. I was worth the trip to the concert hall, but not the attention once I got there. High school widened the gap. Chloe became the family's public project. Her achievements were announced at dinners, shared on social media, celebrated with dinners out. Mine were noted quietly, if at all. When I made the honor roll, it was expected. When she passed a class she'd been struggling with, there was a cake. I stopped expecting cake. I started expecting nothing. And that, ironically, was the gift they gave me without knowing it. I learned to build a life that didn't require their approval to feel real. At 16, I got my first job at a diner 3 blocks from the bus stop. I lied about my age on the application. The manager either believed me or didn't care because the afternoon shift was hard to fill. I washed dishes, bussed tables, and learned that the world outside my house paid me the same whether my parents were proud or not. That was the first time I felt something like freedom. I saved every dollar I could. By the time I graduated high school, I had enough for a deposit on a small apartment near the community college I'd enrolled in. My parents didn't ask how I paid for it. They didn't offer to help. My father's response when I told him I was moving out was a shrug and a reminder that I could always come back if it didn't work out. It worked out. I worked 3 jobs through college, took out the minimum loans, and graduated without a single dollar of help from anyone with my last name. The day I got my degree, I sat alone in the audience while Chloe posted photos from a vacation my parents had taken her on. I didn't call them. They didn't call me. The silence had become comfortable. The apartment I eventually bought was a studio in a building that had seen better decades. 400 square feet, a kitchen the size of a closet, and a window that faced a brick wall. But it was mine. No Costner, no family money, no strings. I signed the papers with a pen I bought at the drugstore and sat on the floor of my empty living room, surrounded by boxes, feeling something I couldn't name. It took me years to realize it was safety. That apartment became my sanctuary. I painted the walls a warm gray, hung string lights that made the small space feel bigger, and filled the bookshelf with second-hand novels. It wasn't much, but it was mine in a way nothing else had ever been. And for a while, that was enough, until the wedding. Chloe got engaged at 24 to a man named Derek, whose family had money, and whose opinions my parents adopted as their own. The engagement party was at a country club I'd never been to. I attended because attendance was mandatory if I wanted to avoid a phone call that would last an hour. I stood near the bar, holding a glass of water, watching my family orbit my sister like she was the center of a small, warm sun. That's when I first heard the word, apartment, used in a sentence that didn't include me. My mother was talking to Derek's mother. Chloe and Derek need a place to start, she said, swirling her wine. Something central, something they can make their own. Mallory's little place would be perfect. It's in that up-and-coming area. My stomach turned cold. I waited for someone to say it was a joke. No one did. Over the next 2 months, the hints became statements, and the statements became demands. At first, it was framed as a request. Wouldn't it be nice if Chloe and Derek could use your place for a while? Then it shifted. The family thinks it would be best. Then, finally, the dinner. I showed up because I didn't know what else to do. The table was set like a celebration. Chloe was glowing. Derek was nodding along. My parents sat at opposite ends, wearing the same expression, the one that said they had already decided and my presence was just a formality. Halfway through the meal, my father cleared his throat. "We have an announcement," he said, looking at Chloe. "Go ahead, sweetheart." My sister smiled at me, not a warm smile, a smile that said she knew she had already won. "So, Mallory, the family has been talking, and we think it's only fair that you give me and Derek your apartment as a wedding gift. It's perfect for us, and honestly, you don't really need that much space, right? You're so independent." She said the word like it was a punchline. I looked around the table. My mother was nodding. My father was waiting. Derek was checking his phone. No one asked me how I felt. No one mentioned the years of work, the savings, the sacrifices. It was already decided. I put down my fork. The room felt smaller than my 400 square feet. And in that moment, I made a choice that would burn every bridge I had left. I excused myself from the table, not with a speech, not with a slam of the door, just a quiet "I need some air." I never came back. I walked out of that restaurant and didn't stop until I reached my apartment. The whole way there, I felt something shifting in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, it was clarity. The kind that comes when you stop pretending a situation is fixable. My hands were steady when I unlocked my door. I stood in the center of my 400 square feet and looked at everything I had built. The bookshelf I assembled alone with a cheap screwdriver. The pots I bought one at a time. The rent receipts I kept in a folder labeled proof. No Costner, no safety net, no one else's name on any of it. I sat on my floor and pulled up the building management portal on my phone. I hadn't checked the lease terms since I signed, but I knew one thing for certain. Only my name was on the contract. I scrolled to the section about lock changes. It said I could request a rekey at my own expense, 24-hour turnaround, no questions asked. I submitted the request at 11:47 p.m. Then I started packing. Not everything, just what mattered. My laptop, my external hard drive, a change of clothes, my grandmother's ring, the only thing my parents had ever given me that wasn't a guilt trip. I filled a single duffel bag and a backpack. 400 square feet of life condensed into 2 bags. I looked around at the string lights, the gray walls, the second-hand novels I'd never finish. They were things. I could rebuild things. At 2:58 a.m., my phone buzzed. The locksmith confirmation. I walked downstairs in my sneakers and stood in the dim lobby while a man in a vest swapped the cylinder in under 10 minutes. He handed me 3 new keys. I put one in my pocket, one in my bag, and dropped the third into a drawer at the back of my closet. I took a photo of the new lock. Then I turned off my phone and went asleep at a motel 6 blocks away. When I woke up, I had 28 messages. The first one came at 9:17 a.m. from my mother. "We need to talk about last night." 11 minutes later, my father, "You left before we discussed the apartment." By noon, my sister had sent 7 messages, each one sharper than the last. "Are you ignoring us? This is about the family. You're being dramatic. Derek thinks you're being selfish." At 1:30, my mother tried again. "Mallory, please just call us. Let's be adults about this." I didn't respond. I had nothing left to say to people who had already decided my answer didn't matter. The 28th message came at 9:12 p.m., 2 full days after the dinner. It was from Chloe. "I know you changed the locks. Mom called the building. They told her. You think you're so clever. This isn't over. The family has already made arrangements. You can't just disappear." But I could, and I did. I took a week off work, not because I was hiding, but because I needed to think. I checked into a different motel each night, paid in cash, kept my location tracker off. I spent hours in coffee shops with my laptop, writing down everything I had never let myself say. Pages and pages. I wrote about the bus stop on graduation day, the spelling tests that went on the fridge for one night while trophies got framed shelves. I wrote about the silence and the crumbs and the way independence became a weapon they used against me. And then I wrote the one thing I had never admitted out loud. I didn't want to be their daughter anymore. That sentence sat on the screen for a long time. I stared at it until the cursor blinked like a metronome. Then I saved the document and shut the laptop. The next day, my Aunt Meredith called. She was the only person in the family who had ever seen the pattern clearly. She didn't bother with small talk. "I heard about the dinner," she said, "and I heard about the locks. Are you okay?" I told her the truth. "I don't know." She was quiet for a moment. "They're not going to stop, Mallory. They've already started calling relatives, telling everyone you've lost your mind, that you're being petty, that Chloe was just excited about the wedding and you overreacted." I felt the familiar twist in my stomach, the need to defend myself, to explain, to prove I wasn't the villain. But then I remembered the 28 messages, the lack of a single "How are you?" the absence of any concern for my life, my plans, my future. "Let them talk," I said. "I don't have to attend every argument I'm invited to." Meredith laughed. It was a sad laugh. "You sound like your grandmother." I didn't know if that was a compliment, but I decided to take it as one. Over the next few weeks, the pressure mounted in ways I hadn't anticipated. My sister didn't just message me. She started posting Instagram stories about family loyalty, about people who forget where they came from, about how hard it is when someone you love chooses selfishness. She didn't name me, but everyone who knew us understood. Our mutual friends started reaching out. Some were sympathetic. "Wow, Chloe seems really upset. Is everything okay?" Others were less kind. "You know, she just wants to start her marriage stable. Can't you help?" One message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years read, "You're making things really awkward for the whole family. Just give her the apartment for a few months." I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't have to. But then my father showed up at my office. I was at my desk at the small marketing firm where I worked. The receptionist called my extension with a note of unease in her voice. "There's a man here who says he's your father. He won't leave until he talks to you." I considered having security escort him out, but I also knew that would only give him more ammunition, more evidence that I was irrational, unstable, uncooperative. So I went to the lobby. He was standing by the entrance, arms crossed, wearing the same expression he'd worn when I told him I wasn't moving back after graduation. Disbelief mixed with irritation, like I was a machine that had malfunctioned. "Let's take this outside," I said. We stood in the parking lot. He didn't waste time. "You're making a fool of yourself, and you're making a fool of us. It's an apartment, Mallory, not a kingdom. Let your sister have it for a year. After that, you can have it back. They'll pay rent." I stared at him. It's my name on the lease, my credit, my history. Do you even understand what that means? He waved his hand. This is about family, about showing up. You've always been so focused on yourself. I could have listed 1,000 counterexamples. The bus, the scholarships, the 3 jobs, the cleaning shifts. I could have shown him the spreadsheet I'd kept since I was 16, tracking every dollar I spent and saved, proving that no one had ever handed me anything. But I was tired of proving myself to people who treated my existence as an inconvenience. I'm not giving her my apartment, I said. Not for a year, not for a month, not for a night. And the more you push, the less I want to be in the same room as any of you. He opened his mouth, closed it, then he said something that surprised me. We'll sue you for the moving costs. I blinked. What? Chloe and Derek already hired a realtor. They put in an offer on a house based on your apartment being sold to give them the down payment. You're costing them money, and we expect you to cover it. I felt the ground tilt. They had already made financial plans based on my apartment being sold. Not borrowed, sold. They had assumed I would give it up entirely. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked back into my office. That night, I sat in my 3rd motel room of the week and pulled up the document I had started. The one I wrote in the coffee shop. I read it again from beginning to end, and then I added a new line at the bottom. I hope you're reading this, Chloe, because the apartment was never the point. I closed the laptop and looked out the window. The parking lot was empty. My phone was silent. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. But I knew it wouldn't last. Someone was going to cross a line. And when they did, I would have to decide if I was ready to burn every bridge between me and the family I was born into. That moment came quicker than I expected. The letter arrived 3 days later. Certified mail. A demand for financial compensation and a threat of legal action if I didn't cooperate. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, representing Chloe and Derek. They claimed I had caused them reliance damages by pulling out of an agreement they said existed. They wanted $23,000 to cover their lost deposit on a house they had planned to buy, and a promise to vacate the apartment within 30 days so they could move in. I read it twice, then I called my Aunt Meredith. She picked up on the first ring. Tell me you didn't get a letter too. They sent one, I said. Certified $23,000. Meredith let out a long breath. They sent me one too, a witness request. They want me to testify that you agreed to give Chloe the apartment at the dinner. They're saying you offered. I felt something cold spread through my chest. I never offered anything. They told me what was happening. I know, she said, but they're telling everyone you said yes at the table, that you were enthusiastic about it, that you only changed your mind after because of some outside influence. I sat down on the edge of my motel bed. They're rewriting history. This is what they do, Mallory. They rewrite until the story fits what they want. But here's the thing, they can't prove it because it never happened, and I won't lie for them. That was the first crack in their plan, but it wasn't the last. The next day, my landlord called. He was a quiet man in his 60s who owned the building and handled maintenance himself. He sounded uncomfortable. Ms. Hayes, I got a call from a woman claiming to be your mother. She said you were having a mental health crisis and that she needed access to your apartment to retrieve important documents. I told her I couldn't do that without your permission. I closed my eyes. Thank you, that was the right call. She also said you might be a danger to yourself, he added quietly. I told her I'd seen you last week and you seemed fine, but I wanted to let you know. They weren't just coming for my apartment. They were coming for my credibility. If they could paint me as unstable, everything I said could be dismissed. The lock change, the silence, the refusal to hand over my home, it would all look like symptoms instead of decisions. I started documenting everything. Screenshots of the messages, copies of the letter, a timeline of every conversation. I wrote down exactly what had been said at the dinner, word for word, while it was still fresh. Then I emailed it all to myself and printed a second copy that I kept in my bag. My father called from a blocked number. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail that I saved. Mallory, this has gone far enough. You're hurting your sister. You're hurting your mother. We're not trying to ruin your life. We just want you to do the right thing. Call me. The right thing. Their definition of right had always been whatever benefited Chloe. I didn't call back, but the pressure kept mounting. 2 days later, I got a notification from my bank. A freeze had been placed on my account. I called customer service, and they told me a family member had reported suspicious activity and requested a security hold. They needed me to come in person with identification to lift it. I walked into that bank branch with my passport, my lease, and my work ID. The manager looked at the notes on my file and then at me. "I'm sorry about this, Ms. Hayes. It appears someone filed a false report. We've flagged the account and added a note that only you can authorize changes going forward." But the damage was done. I couldn't access my money for 3 days. I had to borrow from a coworker to pay for my motel. That was the moment I realized they weren't going to stop. They were willing to use every tool they had: lawyers, banks, family connections, even lies about my mental health, to force me to give up the one thing I had built on my own. I started looking for a lawyer, a real one, not the firm they had hired. I found a woman named Sarah who specialized in property disputes and family coercion. Her office was in a converted house near downtown. She listened to my story without interrupting, then asked one question. "Do you have proof that you bought the apartment without their help?" I slid my folder across her desk. Bank statements, the purchase agreement, tax records showing no gifts or loans from family. A complete paper trail of independence. She read through it in silence, then looked up. "They don't have a case, but they can still make your life very expensive. They can drag you through depositions, file motions, force you to spend time and money defending yourself. The question isn't whether you'll win, it's whether you can afford to fight." I told her I couldn't afford not to. She agreed to take my case on a reduced rate. I signed the retainer and walked out feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks, a thread of hope. But that thread snapped the next morning when I checked my email and found a message from Chloe's lawyer. They were filing a motion for a temporary restraining order that would prevent me from selling or modifying the apartment until the dispute was resolved. They claimed I had already listed it for sale out of spite. I hadn't, but the accusation was designed to make me look vindictive. Sarah called me within the hour. "It's a bluff. They don't have evidence, but a judge might grant it anyway if they make it sound urgent. We need to counterfile with your documentation." The legal battle had officially begun. Over the next week, I learned what it meant to be on the receiving end of a coordinated family campaign. My parents called every relative they could, spinning a story of a daughter who had lost her way, who was being manipulated by outsiders who needed an intervention. 2 cousins I hadn't spoken to in years showed up at my office, asking to talk. I told them I was busy. They left, but not before one of them said, "Your mom is really worried about you." I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just smiled and closed the door. The low point came on a Thursday night. I was sitting in a coffee shop, reviewing Sarah's latest filing when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo, a screenshot of a group chat I wasn't in. The family chat. My mother had written, "We just want our little girl back. The one who used to care about others. Please pray for Mallory." 17 people had replied with prayer emojis and messages of support. I stared at the screen. They had turned me into a project, a wayward daughter who needed saving from herself. They had erased every sacrifice I had made and replaced it with a narrative of a selfish child who had forgotten her family. And in that moment, I realized something that changed everything. They weren't going to stop because they didn't think they were wrong. They genuinely believed that what they were doing was love. That forcing me to comply was the same as caring for me. That my resistance was a sickness to be cured. I couldn't change their minds. I couldn't make them see. But I could stop letting their version of reality define me. I called Sarah the next morning. "What if we go public?" She was quiet. "You mean press?" "Social media. A blog. Something that lets me tell my version before they lock me into theirs." She thought about it. "It's risky. They'll use it against you. But if you have the evidence, it might put pressure on them to settle or back down. I didn't want to settle. I wanted to be free. So I started writing. Not a legal document, not a rant, a simple, honest account of what had happened, starting with the bus stop on graduation day and ending with the certified letter. I included screenshots of the messages and the bank freeze notice. I kept it factual. I kept it calm. I posted it on a Friday evening, not expecting much. By Sunday morning, it had been shared over 12,000 times. The comments were a mix of shock, support, and a few people who called me a liar. But the tide was shifting. Friends I hadn't heard from in years reached out to apologize for taking Chloe's side. Strangers sent messages sharing their own stories of family entitlement and property disputes. One woman wrote that her sister had tried to take her house after their mother died. I was no longer alone. And then, the most unexpected thing happened. My Aunt Meredith called with news that made everything click into place. "They're dropping the lawsuit," she said. "Chloe and Derek, they're pulling out." I felt my breath catch. Why? Because your post went viral in their social circle. Derek's business partners saw it. His family is embarrassed. They told him to back off or risk his reputation. I sat down. "So it's over." "It's over," she said. "But Mallory, they're not going to forgive you for this. You've publicly humiliated them. The family is fractured." I thought about that. A fractured family. Was that worse than the silence I had lived in for years? I looked around my motel room, the temporary life I had built out of necessity. I thought about my apartment, still waiting for me, still mine. "Maybe it was already fractured," I said. "Maybe I was just the last one to notice." I hung up and let the quiet settle around me. For the first time in months, no one was demanding anything from me. But that peace was short-lived, because the next day I got a text from Chloe. "Congratulations, you won, but you lost a family. Was it worth it?" I stared at the words for a long time. Then I typed my reply. The apartment was never the point, but neither was winning. I just wanted to exist without being erased. I never heard from her again. That was the end of the battle over the apartment. But it was also the beginning of something I hadn't expected. The chance to build a family that actually saw me. And that story, the aftermath, the rebuild, the people who showed up when my blood relatives walked away, that's where the real ending lies. I went back to my apartment the next morning. The key still fit. The string lights were still on the timer I had set before I left. Everything was exactly where I had left it, the books, the pots, the proof folder on the desk. 400 square feet that had become a battlefield. But now it was just a home again. I stood in the center of the room and waited to feel something. Relief, maybe. Victory. But what came instead was a strange, hollow quiet. The fight was over, but the silence it left behind was louder than I expected. For the first time in weeks, I checked my phone without dread. The messages had stopped. No demands, no accusations, no carefully crafted guilt trips. My family had gone silent. Not the kind of silence that meant they had come to understand. The kind that meant they had written me out of their story entirely. I learned through a mutual friend that Chloe's wedding went ahead as planned. I was not invited. My name was not mentioned. In the official family narrative, I had become a chapter that was edited out of the final draft. That should have hurt, and it did in a distant way, but it also freed me from a role I had never asked to play. I spent the next few months rebuilding. Not the apartment, that was fine. Rebuilding my life. I went back to work and threw myself into projects I had neglected. I started saying yes to invitations from people I had kept at arm's length. Coworkers invited me for drinks. A neighbor asked if I wanted to join her book club. Small things, but they added up to something I had never had. A circle of people who chose me because they liked me, not because we shared DNA. One evening, about 3 months after the lawsuit ended, I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten address, no return name. I opened it with cautious hands. It was from my Aunt Meredith. "I know you might not want to hear from anyone with our last name, but I wanted you to know that I see you. I always have. And I'm proud of you for standing your ground. You did what none of us had the courage to do. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. No strings, No family agenda, just me. I cried when I read it, not because of the words themselves, but because it was the first time anyone in my family had told me they were proud of me without attaching a condition. I called her that night. We talked for 3 hours. She told me things I had never known, that my grandmother had a similar falling out with her siblings over property, that the pattern of favoritism ran deeper than I realized, that my father had once confided to her that he didn't know how to relate to a child who didn't need him. "You were too independent," Meredith said. "That scared him. He only knows how to love people who depend on him, and you never did." "That's not my fault," I said. "No," she agreed. "It's not, but understanding it might help you let go of the hope that they'll change." She was right. I had been holding on to a version of my family that existed only in my imagination. A version where they woke up one day and saw me clearly. That day was never coming. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand the patterns I had learned so I didn't repeat them. My therapist told me something that stuck. "You spent your whole life being the responsible one. Now you get to be the one who is allowed to need things." I didn't know how to do that. I was learning. The final surprising detail came about 6 months after the lawsuit. I got a call from the building manager. He said a woman had come by asking questions about the apartment. She claimed to be a real estate agent working with my sister. I told him I hadn't authorized any sale. He said he figured as much, and that he had turned her away. But the call made me realize something. They still hadn't let go. Not really. They were just waiting for me to slip. So I made a decision. I sold the apartment. Not to them, not under pressure. I sold it on my own terms to a young couple who had been saving for years and fell in love with the string lights and the gray walls. I took the money and used it as a down payment on a small house in a different city. A fresh start, 400 miles away from the family that had tried to erase me. The day I left, I took one last photo of the empty apartment. The walls were bare. The bookshelf was gone. The only thing left was the key on the counter, waiting for the new owners. I didn't look back. In the new city, I built a life that was entirely mine. I found a job at a small agency that valued my skills. I adopted a rescue cat who slept on my keyboard while I worked. I made friends who knew nothing about the lawsuit or the dinner or the 28 messages. They knew me as Mallory, the woman who made excellent pasta and laughed too loudly at her own jokes. I was no longer the independent daughter, the reliable one, the one who didn't need much. I was just myself. And that was enough. But there was one more thing I hadn't resolved. One loose thread that kept tugging at the edges of my peace. I still hadn't told my parents what I really thought. Not in a letter, not in a voicemail, not in a courtroom. I had defended myself, but I had never spoken my truth directly to them. So one evening, about a year after the move, I sat down and wrote an email. I kept it short. I didn't accuse. I didn't demand. I just said what I needed to say. "I don't hate you. I don't want revenge. I just want you to know that I was always there. I just needed you to see me. And you never did. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done waiting. I hope you find peace. I already have." I pressed send before I could second guess myself. I never got a reply. But that was okay. I hadn't written it for them. I had written it for the version of myself who had stood at a bus stop in her graduation robe, wondering if she mattered. She did. She always did. And that is the story of how I lost an apartment and found myself. If you've ever been told you're too much or not enough, this is for you. Because that story I just told isn't really about an apartment or a wedding or a family dinner gone wrong. It's about the moment you realize that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally have attached conditions you never agreed to. I spent 23 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never set for me. I learned to be small so others could be big. I learned to need nothing so others could take everything. And I learned that independence, when weaponized, becomes the perfect excuse for neglect. "You're so strong. You don't need as much. You'll figure it out." Those phrases are not compliments. They are permission slips for abandonment. Here's what I want you to take from this. You are not required to burn yourself down to keep others warm. You are not obligated to give away the home you built with your own hands just because someone else decided it belongs to them. And you are not selfish for protecting the life you fought for. Walking away from family is not a betrayal. It is the hardest kind of love, the love you show yourself when no one else will. The lingering question is this: what would you do if the people who raised you suddenly decided your worth was measured by what you could provide? Would you bend? Would you fight? Would you walk away and start over 400 miles away with a cat and a lease in your own name? There is no wrong answer, but there is a right one for you. My name is Mallory. I no longer measure my value by the space I occupy in someone else's story. I am the author of my own. If this story reached something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories about people who chose themselves, about boundaries that held, and about the messy, beautiful process of building a life on your own terms, hit subscribe. Because this channel is not just about revenge. It's about reclaiming what was yours all along. See you in the next one.